And also important to note that royal recommendation is key here, as bills involving public spending require a royal recommendation that can only be obtained by the government and presented by a minister in the Commons. So with more on all this, we're now joined by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Yves Giroux. Mr. Giroux, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So as we talk about this extension of OAS, let's talk a bit of the numbers here, because the Bloc Québécois, they peg it at around $12 billion for the first 5 years, $3 billion every year afterwards, but you estimate the cost will actually be higher. Just how much higher?
About $4 billion higher, and it's because it's $3 billion in the first year of the implementation, and we estimated that in May 2023, progressively rising to $3.5 billion after or during the fifth year, and it keeps on increasing after due to inflation and also population growth in that segment of the population, those aged 65 to 74.
So what does that do then? If the cost is higher, and again, this is driven by demographics, as you say, Canada's population is aging. So if this is driven by demographics, what does that do to the financial guardrails as defined by this government? Because they're not talking about a balanced budget. They're talking about keeping within a certain percentage. What does that potential increase do to that challenge?
And that's the interesting question for the government, notably. As you pointed out, the government has fiscal guardrails, one of which is to have a deficit that's no higher than 1% of GDP, so a deficit that's no higher than 1% of the size of the economy by 26-27. In the last budget, the government itself, based on its projections, was at 0.9, so very close to the 1% threshold they said they wouldn't cross. So if the government proceeds with enrichments to the old age security, there is a significant, very significant risk that they'll cross that threshold, so that the deficit will be higher than 1% of GDP in 26-27, which would lead the government with difficult choices. So either they try to limit the cost of this, but then that wouldn't be Bill C-319, or they increase taxes, or they reduce expenditures in other areas. But we know that there are other areas of pressures, notably increasing spending on defense to get closer to the NATO target of 2%. So this is probably a real conundrum for the Minister of Finance, finance officials, and the government as a whole, because of these fiscal anchors that the government has committed to and the cost of this measure.
And I guess it becomes a value judgment then, right? I mean, do you make cuts elsewhere in order to allow this to happen? Do you increase taxes, as you say? Do you ignore your guardrails already? Which one is more acceptable to the Canadian public? And I guess that's a quandary that the government will be left with if they actually go ahead with this extension.
Exactly. Other fiscal guardrails included a deficit no higher than $40 billion. And that's also at risk, depending what the implementation date would be for such a measure, and a declining debt to GDP ratio, which could also be postponed if the government proceeds with the enrichments to old age security.
Enrichments, as you say, let's talk a bit more about that, because it's not as if OAS doesn't exist. It exists for people who are in need. There's already an extension given to people 75 and older, and that's basically trying to guarantee that people who may have run out of their savings don't have $0 in their bank account, right? So there's already a percentage of government spending meant to secure seniors in this country. Just in terms of a dollar figure, what are we looking at here?
For individual seniors who are eligible for the OAS, it's $718 a month currently. And for those 75 and over, it's $790 per month. So there's a $72 difference between these two, so 10%. And in terms of overall spending, we're talking well in excess of $60 billion per year, rising to $80 billion per year in a few years because of the inflation and population growth.
So $80 billion out of what, about $500 billion in spending?
Yeah, roughly speaking. So slightly less these days, but soon we'll cross that threshold.
Okay, so that's the percentages they're dealing with, but as you say, as much as there is a benefit cash-wise, if this goes through, there's also going to be a reckoning as to how you actually pay for that. That said then, in terms of demographics, if we can go back very quickly there, you know, we're approaching the end now of the baby boom cohort. People that are approaching retirement, born in 1964 is the end of the baby boomers. And according to StatsCan, we are approaching a point where by the middle of this century, really just about 25 years from now, 1 in 4 Canadians will be a senior citizen. Can the public purse actually afford such an extension for OAS?
That's a very good question. Strictly speaking, we probably can, but it also means that the government will have to make choices. So the government, if it goes ahead with this, will be hard-pressed or will have choices to make if it also wants to extend dental care and increase spending on national defense, for example, or enrich other programs. So we can, but we can probably not do everything that the public is calling on the government to do, while also not increasing taxes or reducing expenditures in other areas.
Good to know the options ahead of us. Yves Giroux, thank you very much for that.
My pleasure.